With that, and success that has been made arresting public safety threats and other priorities since this surge operation began, as well as the unprecedented levels of coordination we have obtained from state officials and local law enforcement, I have proposed, and President Trump has concurred, that this surge operation conclude. A significant drawdown has already been underway this week and will continue through the next week. We have a lot of work to do across this country to remove public safety risk who shouldn't even be in this country, and to deliver on President Trump's promise for strong border security and mass deportation. Law enforcement officers drawing down from this surge operation will either return to their duty stations or be assigned elsewhere to achieve just that.
If you woke up this morning thinking nothing major had shifted, you may want to look again, because in the early hours today, the federal government announced that what it called Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota would be drawing down. The surge is ending. Officers will be reassigned. Resources will be redeployed elsewhere. My name is Olivia Hale. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. That announcement alone changes the tone of the entire conversation. For weeks, Minnesota had become a flashpoint in a much larger national debate. Immigration enforcement, federal authority, state resistance, protest rights, and public trust in law enforcement. Now, the administration says the surge operation is concluding. But what does that actually mean? Let's slow this down and break it apart carefully. At a press conference, federal officials said that the surge had achieved its objectives. They cited arrests of individuals they described as public safety threats. They highlighted coordination with state and local authorities. And they stated that officers involved in the surge would now either return to their original assignments or be deployed to other regions to continue enforcement efforts. In plain terms, the extra federal presence in Minnesota is being reduced. Supporters of the surge say this was a necessary enforcement action aimed at removing individuals who pose safety risks. They argue that federal immigration enforcement is a core constitutional power. Under Article 1, Congress sets immigration law, and under Article 2, the executive branch enforces it. From that perspective, the surge was simply a policy choice within executive authority. Critics saw it very differently. They argued that the surge felt like a show of force. They questioned whether tactics used during enforcement operations escalated tensions rather than reduced them. They pointed to viral videos of physical encounters between officers and protesters. They worried about long-term damage to trust between immigrant communities and local institutions. When federal power meets local resistance, friction is inevitable. Now that the surge is winding down, both sides are claiming validation. Some are framing it as proof that enforcement worked and resources are being reallocated strategically. Others are calling it a retreat from an operation that created controversy and backlash. But words like retreat and victory are political language. What matters more is what actually happened on the ground. Let's look at the state response. Minnesota's governor spoke forcefully about the impact of the surge. He emphasized economic damage to small businesses. He highlighted what he described as long-term emotional effects on children who witnessed enforcement actions in their communities. He argued that if federal agencies deploy resources into a state and cause disruption, there should be accountability and financial responsibility for recovery.
The federal government needs to pay for what they broke here. There are going to be accountability on the things that happened, but one of the things, the incredible and immense costs that were borne by the people of this state, the federal government needs to be responsible. You don't get to break things and just leave without doing something about it. So we're going to be asking the federal delegation to be investing and doing the things necessary. We have been in contact with federal leadership as a negotiation is happening right now on DHS funding and all of the things that we have an expectation, whether it be the investigations, whether it be going forward, no masks, because this, I got to tell you, one of the things, and I'm in contact with a lot of my colleagues, both at the federal level with the Senate and the House, but especially governors. I don't want these folks showing up somewhere else and doing this. So the changes that need to be made, the investments that need to come back, they need to show, they being the federal government and they being this administration, they need to do more. But I'm not going to hold my breath that the federal government's going to do the right thing. What I am going to do is I'm going to bet on the people of this state. And when we come into this legislative session, an expectation is this should be a bipartisan effort to protect these businesses, to protect what we have in Minnesota, to make changes here to improve this state. That should be very easy. And I think we've seen just some of the data surrounding this. There's very few things in this state that are more unpopular than what just happened to us. And there's few things that are more popular than recovery and supporting small businesses. So
That raises an important question. When federal operations affect local economies, who pays for cleanup, security costs, or business losses? Historically, there is no automatic reimbursement structure. Congress can appropriate disaster relief funds. It can authorize grants. But unless legislation passes, states often absorb short-term costs. This isn't just about Minnesota. It's about federalism. The United States is built on shared sovereignty. States retain police powers. The federal government retains immigration authority. When those powers intersect, especially in politically charged contexts, disputes are inevitable. Now layer in the protest element. Several exchanges in Congress this week focused on whether verbal confrontation with federal officers constitutes assault or obstruction. Senators questioned Department of Homeland Security officials directly. Is yelling at officers a crime? Is filming enforcement actions illegal? The officials answered clearly, no. Verbal protest alone is not assault. Filming law enforcement in public spaces is not inherently a crime. That clarity matters. The First Amendment protects speech, even speech that is loud, angry, or uncomfortable. Courts have repeatedly upheld the right to record police officers performing duties in public, so long as recording does not physically interfere. That constitutional baseline should not be controversial, but public trust is shaped by perception, not just law. When videos circulate showing forceful arrests or physical confrontations, even if legally justified in specific contexts, they can create broader anxiety. Communities begin asking, was that necessary? Was it proportional? Was it avoidable? Those questions don't disappear simply because an operation ends. Now pivot to Washington. At the same time as the Minnesota drawdown announcement, congressional hearings were underway involving the Attorney General and other officials. Lawmakers pressed for clarity about past associations referenced in Epstein-related files.
Yes or no, has the Justice Department asked Secretary Lutnick about his ties to Epstein?
Excuse me. Secretary Lutnick has addressed those ties himself.
I'm asking you, has the Justice Department specifically asked Secretary Lutnick about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein?
He has addressed those ties himself.
Has the DOJ asked Secretary Phelan about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein?
I don't know whether he has addressed those or not.
Has the Deputy Secretary Feinberg talked to the Department of Justice about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein? Yes or no? Has the Department of Justice talked to Deputy Secretary Feinberg about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein, which are clearly spelled out in the files? It's a very simple question. It's not a trick question. I'm just asking you.
Yeah, I'm stunned that you want to continue talking about.
Oh my gosh.
Epstein
Okay, I'm reclaiming my time. I'm asking you not a trick question, a simple question. Okay, so what is clear is we have evidence.
Do you know who Chris Malin is?
We have evidence that 3 senior officials within the Trump administration have ties to Jeffrey Epstein. And what
does ties mean?
I can conclude from what you are saying that you have not talked to them.
What does ties mean?
I think Americans would be shocked to learn that you are not interested in talking with these officials who have ties to Jeffrey Epstein.
What does ties mean? Can you define that?
Across the world, prominent men
ties?
who've been exposed in the files have resigned their jobs in disgrace. And that's a good first start. And that same
Disgrace
standard,
is not saying the word
this
Chris
same
Malin.
standard should apply here. And Americans want accountability.
Who is Chris Malin?
Was the president
he?
aware? Please stop talking. It is not your time to ask
was
questions. It is not your time. I'm reclaiming my time, Mr. Chair.
One second.
Time belongs to the gentlelady from Vermont.
They questioned whether Department of Justice officials had interviewed certain cabinet members. They debated the scope of document redactions. It is critical to be precise here. No new charges were announced. No court findings were issued in those hearings. Lawmakers were asking questions, not issuing verdicts. Oversight is not prosecution, but oversight hearings shape narrative. When members of Congress ask pointed questions and receive incomplete answers, viewers draw conclusions. When the Attorney General defends the department's conduct, supporters see stability while critics see deflection. That dynamic is normal in congressional oversight. It becomes explosive when tied to emotionally charged cases. Now add another dimension: pardons. During questioning, it was noted that an individual previously charged in connection with January 6th was pardoned and later employed within the Justice Department. That raised debate about consistency in law enforcement standards. Presidential pardon power is absolute under Article 2, except in cases of impeachment. Presidents from both parties have issued controversial pardons. Legally, once pardoned, a person's criminal liability for that offense is erased. Politically, however, hiring decisions still carry symbolic weight. The Attorney General defended the department's actions. Lawmakers criticized them. The public sees conflict. This is where we need to separate fact from rhetoric. Fact: Operation Metro Surge is being drawn down. Fact: Federal officials say the mission achieved its objectives. Fact: Minnesota leaders argue the surge caused harm and demand accountability. Fact: Congressional hearings included sharp questioning about DOJ transparency and hiring decisions. Fact: Federal immigration enforcement remains a constitutional authority of the executive branch. Everything else is interpretation. Now consider the broader political context. Immigration enforcement has been one of the defining issues of the last decade. Border security polls consistently rank high among voter concerns. But so do civil liberties and treatment of immigrants. The administration's strategy appears to involve high-visibility enforcement in select regions. When one region's surge concludes, resources may move elsewhere. That's what officials implied in the press conference. So is this surrender or strategic redeployment? That depends on perspective. From a federal operations standpoint, ending a surge does not equal abandoning enforcement. It can mean mission complete or mission shift. From a state standpoint, ending the surge may feel like relief after weeks of tension. And from a political standpoint, optics matter. If voters in Minnesota broadly oppose the surge, ending it reduces friction locally. If voters nationally prioritize aggressive enforcement, redeploying officers elsewhere signals commitment to campaign promises. This is a balancing act. Meanwhile, economic anxiety remains high nationwide. Inflation pressures, housing affordability challenges, healthcare costs, those issues sit in the background of every political debate. When federal enforcement operations dominate headlines, critics argue it distracts from economic concerns. Supporters argue security is foundational to economic stability. Both arguments resonate with different audiences. Now zoom out further. When bipartisan figures, including Republican governors or senators, question aspects of enforcement tactics or event planning, that signals complexity. It shows this is not a clean partisan split. In Oklahoma, Governor Kevin Stitt publicly objected to what he saw as exclusion of bipartisan participation in a governor's meeting. That dispute reflects a broader theme: governance versus politics. When national political leaders host events framed around party alignment rather than state representation, friction can follow. At its core, this moment is about power distribution: federal power, state power, executive authority, legislative oversight, public protest rights. When all of those collide at once, headlines intensify. But here's what matters most going forward. Will federal agencies conduct after-action reviews of Minnesota operations? Will Congress pursue legislation clarifying protest protections or enforcement standards? Will state leaders seek reimbursement or policy concessions? Will the administration modify tactics in future surge operations? Those are measurable outcomes. Everything else is noise. Right now, we are in what Governor Walz himself described as a trust but verify phase. Announcements have been made. Drawdowns are underway. But communities will watch closely to see whether federal presence truly diminishes and whether future deployments follow different guidelines. Politics thrives on dramatic language: surrender, defeat, victory, chaos. Governance thrives on documentation, coordination, and results. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. The surge happened. It created tension. It is ending. Hearings happened. Questions were asked. Answers were contested. Federal power remains intact. State resistance remains vocal. And here is where the story becomes less about Minnesota and more about the structure of American government itself. Because when a federal surge begins and then winds down under public scrutiny, it exposes something deeper: how power is exercised, how it is challenged, and how it is recalibrated. Let's step back and examine the timeline. A federal enforcement surge is deployed. Extra officers are assigned. Arrests are made. Protests follow. Videos circulate. Governors speak out. Members of Congress question tactics. National media amplifies clips. Pressure builds. Then the administration announces a drawdown. That pattern is not new in American governance. It has happened with disaster responses, public health operations, and law enforcement initiatives before. What makes this one politically charged is the subject: immigration. Immigration sits at the intersection of law, identity, economics, and sovereignty. It triggers strong reactions across ideological lines. Now that the surge is ending, we have to ask, what metrics define success? Federal officials say they targeted public safety threats and achieved coordination with local law enforcement. That is their benchmark. Critics say the surge created economic disruption and community trauma. That is theirs. Both claims can exist simultaneously. Arrests can occur while trust erodes. Enforcement can happen while public confidence declines. Success depends on what you measure. This is why oversight hearings matter. When lawmakers questioned officials about redactions in Epstein-related files, about internal investigations, about hiring decisions tied to pardoned individuals, they were exercising constitutional oversight authority. The executive branch enforces law. The legislative branch monitors how it is enforced. That tension is not dysfunction. It is design. But the tone of hearings can shape public trust. When lawmakers feel answers are evasive, they say so publicly. When officials feel questions are politically motivated, they say so publicly. In a polarized environment, oversight easily becomes spectacle, and spectacle drives narrative. Now consider the messaging layer. Shortly after the drawdown announcement, political rhetoric intensified. Some framed it as a concession under pressure, others framed it as proof of operational success. That's politics. But the underlying question is operational. Will federal enforcement priorities shift geographically? Officials suggested redeployment across the country to pursue what they described as mass deportation objectives. That signals continuity of policy, not reversal. So the Minnesota drawdown may not represent a broader change in immigration enforcement strategy. It may represent a tactical adjustment. Now look at the economic overlay. When the governor spoke about small businesses being harmed, that resonated because local economies are fragile. Even temporary disruptions can affect payroll, supply chains, and customer traffic. If protests block streets or enforcement activity increases fear among customers, small businesses feel it quickly. But assigning responsibility for those losses is complicated. Is it federal presence? Is it protest activity? Is it broader economic conditions? Often, it's all three. Federal reimbursement for law enforcement or disaster costs usually requires congressional appropriation. Without legislation, states absorb financial consequences. That's where political negotiation enters. The governor signaled that Minnesota's congressional delegation would push for federal funding in upcoming DHS negotiations. That transforms the issue from protest politics into budget politics. And budget politics is often where real outcomes are decided. Now pivot back to civil liberties. Senator Rand Paul's line of questioning was notable because it cut through ideological framing and focused on constitutional basics. Is yelling a crime? Is filming a crime? When federal officials responded no, they reinforced First Amendment protections publicly and clearly. That exchange matters because it sets expectations for future enforcement conduct. If officers know that verbal protest alone does not justify physical force, training protocols may adjust accordingly. If communities hear that filming is lawful, transparency increases. Those small clarifications can have outsized impact. But accountability does not end with verbal acknowledgement. It requires policy reinforcement. Will DHS issue updated guidance? Will training modules change? Will internal reviews be published? That is what observers should watch next. Now examine the national political implications. Immigration remains one of the most polarizing issues in the country. Polling often shows voters split between prioritizing border security and prioritizing humane treatment. Enforcement surges satisfy one group while alarming another. When a surge ends, each side reads into it confirmation of their worldview. Supporters say, enforcement worked and is moving forward elsewhere. Critics say, pressure forced reconsideration. The truth likely lies in bureaucratic decision-making that balances resources, optics, and political cost. Another dimension that cannot be ignored is media amplification. In the digital age, a single clip can shape perception nationwide. A confrontation between officers and protesters can travel farther than an official press release. That asymmetry influences strategy. Governments now anticipate viral backlash when deploying visible operations. They weigh not only legal authority but public reaction velocity. This Minnesota episode illustrates that dynamic. Now let's consider the federal-state relationship more deeply. The Constitution creates dual sovereignty. States cannot nullify federal immigration law, but they can influence how federal operations interact with local law enforcement. Some states choose cooperation agreements under 287G. Others limit collaboration. Minnesota's approach appears to lean toward protecting local autonomy while contesting certain enforcement tactics. That creates friction, but friction is not collapse. It is negotiation, and negotiation often produces recalibration. The governor's remarks about trust but verify signal cautious optimism rather than celebration. That tone matters. It suggests recognition that announcements must be matched by action. Communities will watch whether officers truly depart and whether enforcement intensity drops. At the same time, the administration will watch national reaction. If voters in other states applaud strong enforcement, surges may continue elsewhere. If backlash grows, tactics may evolve. This is political feedback in action. Now let's address another layer: narrative saturation. While Minnesota dominated headlines, congressional hearings about DOJ transparency and past associations dominated others. That convergence amplifies emotional response. When immigration enforcement controversies and document transparency debates unfold simultaneously, critics see a pattern of institutional strain. Supporters see coordinated opposition narratives. In reality, these are parallel policy arenas colliding in time. That timing increases intensity. The administration's messaging strategy often includes pivoting to economic indicators, stock market highs, GDP growth, job numbers, during controversy. That tactic aims to recenter discussion on macroeconomic performance. But voters do not process issues in isolation. Economic stability and institutional trust coexist in the same mental space. If one feels unstable, the other may feel uncertain. Now consider the political risk calculation. Ending a surge reduces immediate flashpoints. It lowers nightly news tension. It removes viral confrontation footage from the cycle. That alone can cool rhetoric. But it does not resolve the underlying policy divide. The border remains politically volatile. Deportation strategy remains contested. Federal-state coordination remains delicate. What Minnesota reveals is how quickly local enforcement can become national theater. And what happens next will depend on whether both sides use this moment to escalate or recalibrate. Will lawmakers pursue bipartisan immigration reform? Will DHS adjust communication strategy? Will state leaders collaborate on enforcement protocols that protect both safety and rights? Those are the practical paths forward. If none of those occur, similar episodes may repeat elsewhere. The American system does not eliminate conflict. It manages it through institutional channels. Right now, those channels are active. Press conferences, hearings, negotiations, budget talks, and beneath all of it, communities trying to return to normalcy. The Minnesota drawdown is not an ending. It is a pause point. What matters is whether the next move increases confrontation or reduces it. And this is where the broader meaning comes into focus. Because what happened in Minnesota is not just a local enforcement story. It is a snapshot of how modern American politics now operates: fast, reactive, amplified, and layered with constitutional tension. When the federal government deploys a surge operation into a state, that is an assertion of executive authority. When a governor publicly pushes back and demands accountability, that is an assertion of state sovereignty. When Congress questions tactics and transparency, that is legislative oversight. When citizens protest and record events on their phones, that is civic participation. All four of those forces collided at once. That collision is not collapse. It is democracy under stress. The question now is what direction that stress pushes the system. First, let's look at the enforcement side. The administration made clear that while the Minnesota surge is ending, immigration enforcement is not. Officers will be reassigned. Priorities remain intact. That means this is not a policy reversal. It is a redistribution of resources. So if anyone expected a wholesale retreat from aggressive enforcement, that is not what was announced. But if critics were looking for a reduction in visible federal presence in Minnesota specifically, that is what is happening. Both statements can be true. This is why framing matters so much. Calling it surrender oversimplifies it. Calling it victory oversimplifies it. It is a tactical shift within a broader enforcement strategy. Now consider the state's position. Governor Walz emphasized recovery. He talked about small businesses. He talked about children forming long-term memories of enforcement scenes. He talked about seeking federal compensation. That signals that Minnesota's next phase is stabilization. Stabilization is political language for let's lower the temperature. Whether that temperature stays low depends on future federal actions. If redeployment elsewhere produces similar friction, the national debate reignites in a new location. If enforcement becomes less visible and more targeted, the national spotlight may move on. That leads to the most important political reality: attention is currency. In modern politics, visibility equals intensity. The Minnesota surge was visible. It produced viral clips. It triggered hearings. It triggered statements. Now that visibility is decreasing. When visibility decreases, narrative energy often decreases with it. But unresolved issues do not disappear. They simmer. Now let's zoom out to the federal-state relationship. For decades, immigration enforcement has tested the limits of cooperative federalism. Some states resist participation, others welcome it. The Constitution allows federal supremacy in immigration law, but practical enforcement requires local coordination. Minnesota represents one model, Texas represents another, Arizona another, California another. That patchwork reality means national policy always looks different on the ground depending on location. What Minnesota demonstrated is that when enforcement operations intersect with strong local opposition, political cost increases. Administrations calculate cost versus benefit constantly. Tactical adjustments reflect that calculus. Now add Congress to the equation. The hearings this week were intense. Lawmakers questioned DOJ officials about transparency and hiring decisions. They pressed on whether certain officials were interviewed about past associations. They challenged redactions. They cited pardons. They cited videos. Oversight hearings do not produce instant change. They create public records. They signal concerns. They put officials on notice. Whether those hearings result in legislation, internal reviews, or no action at all will determine their long-term impact. But the symbolism matters. When senators from across ideological lines ask direct constitutional questions, like whether filming law enforcement is legal, and get clear answers, that reinforces democratic norms. When heated exchanges occur, it also reveals how polarized trust has become. The American system thrives when disagreements remain inside institutional channels. So far, that is where this conflict remains. Press conferences, hearings, negotiations. That distinction is critical. Now let's address the political messaging layer. National political figures often pivot quickly from one controversy to another. When immigration dominates headlines, economic talking points follow. When hearings intensify, stock market numbers are cited. When state leaders push back, party leaders counter-message. This is not accidental. Modern administrations operate in a continuous communication cycle. Every policy decision is evaluated not only for impact, but for narrative control. Minnesota became a narrative battleground. Now that the surge is ending, the administration likely hopes the narrative shifts elsewhere, to border metrics, to economic indicators, to legislative wins. Whether that happens depends on whether new friction points emerge. And here is the deeper institutional question. Does this episode strengthen or weaken public trust? For those who believe strong enforcement is necessary, the surge may reinforce confidence. For those who felt alarmed by tactics, the drawdown may restore some trust. For others, the hearings may raise new doubts. Trust is not binary. It moves incrementally. When federal officials publicly acknowledge constitutional limits, such as confirming that verbal protest and filming are lawful, that can strengthen trust. When state leaders call for bipartisan recovery efforts, that can also strengthen trust. Trust grows when leaders de-escalate rather than inflame. That will be the real test moving forward. Will rhetoric soften now that operations are winding down? Will federal and state officials coordinate more quietly? Will Congress pursue structured reform instead of headline conflict? If the answer to those questions is yes, Minnesota becomes a case study in recalibration. If the answer is no, it becomes a template for repetition elsewhere. Now let's address something important: intensity versus outcome. Political language often inflates events. Words like surrender, invasion, victory, betrayal, they travel well online. But governance outcomes are measured in quieter ways. Budget allocations, interagency memos, revised guidance, deployment orders. The drawdown order is an administrative action. The press conference statement is a political signal. The difference matters. What we know for certain is that the surge is being reduced. What we do not yet know is how future operations will be structured or communicated. That uncertainty leaves room for interpretation, and interpretation fuels debate. But at its core, this episode demonstrates something fundamental about American democracy. Power is contested in public. Federal authority was exercised. State authority responded. Citizens protested. Congress questioned. And then the executive branch adjusted. That sequence, whether messy or tense, reflects constitutional balance in motion. The final outcome is not dramatic. It is procedural. Officers reassigned, budgets negotiated, hearings archived, communities rebuilding. The temperature will drop for now in Minnesota. Whether it rises again elsewhere depends on policy choices still to come. And that is the real takeaway. This is not a clean ending. It is a recalibration point. Federal enforcement continues. State leaders remain vigilant. Congress continues oversight. Voters continue watching. The story is not about surrender. It is about the push and pull of authority in a divided country, trying to navigate law, rights, and power at the same time. And that dynamic is not going away anytime soon. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to smash the subscribe button, like, share, and comment.